And therefore, Plato would often justify brainwashing the public to be good, because that was the only way you would have a good state. Well, this is how most people thought, more or less up to the Renaissance. And really the first person to dissent from this was Niccolo Machiavelli, which you all learned about in Global History and Geography 2 years ago, who famously said the end justifies the means. And what he said was basically what I said before in economics, that virtue is not the same as happiness. Virtue is the means, happiness is the ends. Whatever, let's say, if it was a good end, if it makes us happy, then it doesn't matter how we did it. For example, if you're happy by beating someone up, well, that's okay. The end is good, it makes me happy. Or, for example, if I'm in business, I have to think about what's going to keep my business running. And if I have to cut corners and I have to act like a jerk, well, that's okay. If I act like a bad person, that's okay, because it serves the purpose of, let's say, piling up happiness in the company or piling up happiness in the state, and whatever means are necessary are justified by them. So, for example, it's okay to lie if the lying, let's say, advances your career. It's okay to kill people. And Machiavelli many times talks about killing fathers or killing princes, as long as it serves, let's say, a better end. Now, a little bit after Machiavelli, there was someone named Bernard de Mandeville. And Mandeville wrote a long poem called The Fable of the Bees. And he basically argued that greed is good. That actually, if we all try to be good people, we'll actually make things worse. Because good people are always trying to do something for someone else, and very often, if you remember, let's say, the short story by O. Henry, The Gift of the Magi, where two people get each other presents, but they sell the thing their presents were for, and so they actually don't get any better by trying to help each other out. Mandeville basically said private vice, the idea that our little foibles, our bad habits, are actually a public virtue. If you like musicals, there's something called a musical called Avenue Q, which has a very famous song in it called "The Internet is for Porn." And I don't want to belabor this point, but basically, internet is a very functional thing. It's made life better in many ways, but what has driven it is very bad habits, or things that we generally think are bad. And another example of this is wars. War has brought a lot of new technology, and arguably it has defended values that we care about. It has, let's say, stopped very evil people at times, but it's a very bad thing. But sometimes these bad things that we do as individuals, like killing people, or indulging in, let's say, our baser instincts, are actually lead to public virtues, because they lead to, let's say, new technologies, they lead to greater economic growth, and in some ways, greed can be good. And the last thing were these social contract theories. These are like Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, who said, basically government stems from consent of the governed. And what they did is they said, well, the interest of rulers, the interest of the government or kings or whatever else had to be in place at the time, were not the same as the interests of the ruled. And so when those interests diverged, the citizens could overthrow their government because it was based on a social contract. Well, I want to take a step back and talk about kind of the first story that really talked about this idea that greed is good. And that's the story of Job. And this is a story in the Bible, and it's unique in literature because it's the first time where you could say bad things happen to good people. So let me just illustrate the story of Job. So the story of Job starts with God up in heaven one day. He's just chilling, being God. And so one day the devil comes along and God says, well, where have you come from, oh, dear Satan, my friend? And well, Satan goes, well, I've been all around the earth. I've been looking at these humans that you've created. And, so what? God's saying basically, how you hanging? Devil says, I'm chilling, etc. And so the devil says, well, you think you're such a hotshot God. All these people love you. They pray to you. They worship. They sacrifice animals to you. Aren't you think you're just so hot? But you know what? If you took those things away from them, for example, if you didn't give them all the blessings, the good harvests, then all these people become really bad. And so the devil says, look, if the people are really in trouble, right, they come to the devil, right? If I need some money, if I need to provide for my family, I'm going to do bad things. So when push comes to shove, people are basically on my side of this. And so God says, well, look on the earth. Well, I have this guy down here. His name is Job. He's the best guy in the world, right? He's got, he praises God. He goes to church. He does all the things that we want good people to do. And you know what? He has camels and sheep and children and a big house. And the devil says, well, guess what? He only likes you because you gave him the camels and the children and the sheep and the house. And if you took away all those material things, if you took away his happiness, he wouldn't be a good person. And God, of course, says, well, geez, I don't agree with that. God, I think he just, he basically is a good person. I don't need to explain it. He would be a good person if he was poor. And so the devil goes, double dog dare you if you took it all away from him. And God gets a little bit angry and says, I'll take you on that bet. I'll take away all the things that Job has. So God sends a big thunderbolt. The camels fall dead. The children are killed. Thieves come and steal all his possessions. There's an earthquake and his house goes away. And so basically Job is, left there. And later on, the devil says, well, you know what? It's okay. People can do without their possessions. But you know what? We haven't done anything to Job himself. So let's give him some diseases. Okay? And let's give him boils and etc. and make him really miserable. And then he'll curse you, God. Because if you take away someone's happiness, then they're just going to, let's say, come to Satan's side. Well, the other part of this is that Job's friends come up and say, geez, Job, you've had a string of bad luck here. You must have done something really wrong. Because we know that God is good to, let's say, good to the virtuous, and he punishes people when they act badly. So if bad things happen to you, it must be your fault. Right? Well, geez, you have this disease because you must have been a bad person somewhere in your history. And so what you have to do, and this is how most people would think for most of human history, was you had to figure out what you did wrong. Right? You might not have intended to do the wrong thing, but you did, and therefore you had to figure it out. You had to make amends for it, have a sacrifice, ask God for forgiveness. And of course Job says, no, I really haven't done anything wrong. I've been this good guy all along. I don't know why I've had all this bad luck. Well, as Clint Eastwood would say, deserves got nothing to do with it. Okay, just because you're a good person doesn't mean good things are going to happen to you. Let's say, if you could be a good person, and let's say it'll still rain on you, you'll still fail your test, you might not make enough money. And basically the story is the first time where it says, look, bad things can happen to good people. They're not the same thing. Just acting a good person doesn't mean you're going to have a good life. So these are two things, and we have to think of them separately. So this kind of brings us to Adam Smith, around 1776. And he writes a very, very long book called The Wealth of Nations. And he's trying to figure out why are some nations rich and other ones aren't. And he attacked this idea of mercantilism, and he kind of set the basis of what we think is modern capitalism. So he wrote this long book, and he said, well, I have three basic ideas of why England is rich and other countries aren't. The first is the division of labor. And this is what also might call the industrial model of production. And we'll get to it in a second, so I'm not going to define it right now. The second thing was this idea of the invisible hand, which is that if everyone goes and does what they should be doing, or does what they want to do, the invisible hand will lead us and make us cooperate with each other. And basically this was the idea of supply and demand, and the idea of a market system of distributing goods from here to there that would coordinate people. The third thing was something called the labor theory of value. Now, he didn't actually call it the labor theory of value, but he kind of laid the basis for that. And this was the idea that you have to have free labor. If people didn't own themselves, i.e. own their labor, if they were slaves or they were serfs and they had to do what the Lord or their master told them to do, then they wouldn't be able to have a division of labor, right? You would just have masters, and then you have lots of slaves and servants on the lower level. And you couldn't really have an invisible hand because most people couldn't do what they wanted to do, and therefore the invisible hand wouldn't work. And so you had to liberate people. You had to let them control and make decisions for themselves, and control their property and control themselves, and also to control their use of their money and their land. Well, the division of labor basically says that specialization and dividing production into individual tasks is going to increase productivity. So Adam Smith kind of just basically tells a story about a pin maker. And he says, well, look, if you have one pin, you have like one pin maker, and he does all the parts of making the pin. He has to stretch it out, draw the wire, he has to cut it, he has to put the sharp point on it, he has to grind the top to flatten it, and finally he has to bang down the head for the pin. Now, if someone was to do that like thousands of times, it would take so long, because every time you would have to change tasks, you would have to get a different tool, you would have to like pick it up, put it down, you would have to change, and then you would have to go back and start the process over again. But he said, look, if you divide up the jobs, let's say instead of just having one person making all the pins by themselves, and then another person making another set of pins and doing all the tasks of making a pin by themselves, let's say you create a production line, right? The first person would stretch out the wire, the other one would straighten it, another one would cut it, a fourth would put the point on, and they would only do one job. And if they worked in teams and they divided up the labor into different tasks, first of all, they would get better at what they were doing, right? If all you do is cut wire all day, you get really good at it and you can do it really quickly. Practice makes perfect. Now, the other thing about it is that you wouldn't lose time when you switch from one task to another. And he said there's actually a third thing that actually would help you here, which is that if you only studied one thing, you would figure out ways to do it better, right? You would have improvements in the technology of putting points on pins if all you did was put points on pins. And so this would increase productivity. So basically you would have like a 10-fold increase in your productivity if you divided up tasks. And so this is, he says, when you can have a division of labor, basically when you can have a factory, you can divide up the tasks, give the different tasks to different people, and they'll be a lot more productive if they're working by themselves. Now, part of this is the idea that the second basic insight of economics, okay? The parts are more than the whole. When people work together and they cooperate and they have their tasks integrated with each other, they can produce a lot more than if they work separately and just make the pins by themselves and then add up the pins that they would make by themselves. And so Adam Smith kind of said in early part of The Wealth of Nations, the greatest improvement in the productive powers of labor and the greater part of the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which it is anywhere directed or applied seem to have been the effects of the division of labor. So basically said, why are some countries richer? Well, some countries have a division of labor, and other countries are basically kind of in a slave or like a feudal, meaning there's lords and servants.